There was a cereal shaped like something out of a breakfast dream. Tiny waffle squares, crisscrossed just like the real thing, soaked in a syrup so sweet it tasted like someone's grandmother had made it from scratch. A dusting of cinnamon clung to every piece, and the milk turned faintly golden, sweet enough to drink straight from the bowl. For more than 20 years, that cereal sat on supermarket shelves across America, a fixture of Saturday mornings for a generation of kids who grew up watching a cartoon waffle in red sneakers battle a villain named Professor Burnt Toast. Parents bought it without thinking twice. Then one week in the summer of 2018, it simply wasn't there anymore. No farewell announcement, no final commercial. Just an empty space where it used to be. How does a cereal an entire generation grew up on disappear without so much as an explanation? And why, years later, would the company that killed it quietly bring it back? That question is where this story begins. Post had spent decades competing in a cereal aisle crowded with familiar names. And by the mid-1990s, the company's product developers were chasing something different. Not another sugared flake or puffed corn shape, but a breakfast food that borrowed its identity from somewhere else entirely. Waffles. Real, griddle-made, syrup-soaked waffles, the kind families ate on weekend mornings when there was time to stand at the stove. The idea was simple and strange at once. What if that experience could be poured out of a box? The development team built the cereal piece by piece, testing shapes until they landed on a small squarish waffle with the cross-hatch grid pattern unmistakable to anyone who'd ever used a waffle iron. It was made from a blend of corn, oats, and wheat, toasted until it held its crunch, then coated in a syrupy glaze and finished with a dusting of cinnamon. The goal wasn't subtlety, it was recognition. One spoonful, and a kid was supposed to think of Sunday breakfast, not Tuesday cereal. The formula worked, but a cereal needed more than a good bite. It needed a face. And here, Post made a choice that set Waffle Crisp apart from nearly everything else in the aisle. Instead of a cartoon animal or an action hero, the earliest television commercials introduced a room full of gray-haired women working over miniature waffle irons in what the ads called a secret granny factory. The pitch was almost domestic in its simplicity. This wasn't a factory product, it was a homemade one, just built at a scale nobody could see. The tagline promised it tasted like real homemade waffles, and the visual of grandmothers handcrafting each tiny piece was designed to make an industrial breakfast food feel like something a family member had made just for you. It was a strange, almost old-fashioned idea for a 1996 cereal launch, and it worked precisely because it didn't try to be cool. Later commercials shifted the tone, showing packs of kids attempting elaborate break-ins to steal the secret recipe from a suspiciously high-tech factory, or simply make off with as much Waffle Crisp as they could carry. The joke was that a cereal this good was worth stealing. Somewhere inside Post's marketing division, someone had understood something simple about the product they'd built. Kids didn't need to be told the cereal was special. They needed to feel like it was rare enough to fight for. That combination, a genuinely different eating experience, wrapped in a mascot built on nostalgia and mock secrecy, gave Waffle Crisp something most new cereals never got, an identity that didn't feel manufactured, even though every piece of it was. It launched into a market that already had plenty of syrup and sugar cereals, but none of them had bothered to borrow the shape of an entirely different breakfast. Waffle Crisp didn't just taste different. It looked like nothing else on the shelf, boxed with the promise of something homemade, sitting between cereals that all suddenly seemed a little more ordinary by comparison. Within a year of its debut, that promise would start showing up in kitchens across the country, not because of an ad campaign alone, but because of the thing every food company hopes for and can rarely engineer. Kids actually loved the taste and told their friends. By the late 1990s, Waffle Crisp had found its place, and that place was Saturday morning. Not just as a cereal, but as part of a ritual that millions of American households repeated without ever thinking of it as one. Wake up before the parents did, pour a bowl too full, turn on the television, and let the cartoons run while the cereal sat in milk just long enough to soften at the edges, but never quite lose its crunch. The waffle shape did something no flake or puff could. It held its bite even as the milk turned a pale gold from the syrup coating, so a kid could eat slowly through an entire episode and still get a satisfying snap on the last spoonful. The commercials leaned hard into that morning because Post understood exactly where the cereal lived in a child's week. Waffle Boy, the anthropomorphic waffle in red sneakers who had replaced the original Granny mascot, spent his airtime defending the cereal from a cartoon villain named Professor Burnt Toast, a rivalry silly enough for a 7-year-old to recite word for word, and memorable enough that people who hadn't eaten the cereal in 20 years could still describe the fight scenes. That kind of recall doesn't happen by accident. It happens when a commercial runs often enough, during the right cartoons, at the right hour, that it becomes part of the furniture of childhood rather than an interruption to it. The cereal box itself became part of the entertainment. Kids read the back panel during breakfast the way earlier generations had read the newspaper. Mazes, jokes, a cartoon strip featuring Waffle Boy's latest standoff with Professor Burnt Toast, because there was nothing else to look at during a bowl of cereal in 1998, and Post knew it. That box was also doing quiet work at the register, standing out on a shelf crowded with cartoon tigers and leprechauns and toucans, a small waffle-patterned rectangle promising something none of its neighbors could, a taste that wasn't invented but borrowed from a breakfast everyone already loved. The cereal's reach went beyond the kitchen table. It found its way onto national television in a moment that had nothing to do with advertising at all. A box of Waffle Crisp appeared in an episode of Friends, the kind of unplanned cultural cameo that no marketing budget can buy, and one that quietly signaled the cereal had become common enough, familiar enough, to sit in the background of a hit sitcom's apartment set without anyone needing to explain what it was. For a product built on the fantasy of a secret granny factory, that kind of casual, ordinary visibility was its own kind of proof. Waffle Crisp wasn't a novelty anymore. It was just what was in the cabinet. That familiarity is what people describe now when they talk about the cereal, decades later, in the fan forums and comment sections where its name still surfaces. The memories aren't really about the cereal's flavor profile in any technical sense. They're about the shape of a morning. One person recalls finishing an entire box in a weekend because it was the only cereal in the house that could survive a full episode of cartoons without turning to mush. Another remembers being the kid who saved it for weekend mornings specifically, rationing it out because a school day bowl felt like the wrong occasion for it. A third remembers it less as a cereal and more as a dessert masquerading as breakfast, sweet enough that finishing the bowl felt like getting away with something. None of these are exceptional stories. That's exactly the point. An entire generation has some version of the same one. Behind the scenes, that kind of demand meant something concrete. Production lines running to keep pace with a cereal that had become a genuine national seller rather than a regional curiosity, and a sales force that had, for a stretch of years, an unusually easy pitch to make to grocery buyers. A product with a built-in identity, a mascot kids already recognized, and a flavor gimmick no competitor had quite matched. That's not a hard sell in a category where most new cereals fail within a year or two of launch. For the people working the factory floor and the people working a regional sales route, Waffle Crisp in its prime years was the rare product that more or less sold itself, box after box, region after region, without the constant reinvention most cereals needed to stay relevant. And that success bought Waffle Crisp something else, something less visible but just as important. Staying power. Most novelty cereals, the ones built entirely around a gimmick, a shape, a mascot, burn bright for 2 or 3 years and then quietly vanish once the gimmick stops feeling new. Waffle Crisp didn't. It kept selling through the late 90s, through the early 2000s, through a full mascot change that most cereals don't survive without losing their identity entirely. It became, in the plainest sense, a constant. The kind of product a parent restocked automatically, the kind a kid assumed would always be there, the kind nobody thought to appreciate while it was still on the shelf. Which raises the question almost nobody was asking back then, because nobody had any reason to. What does a cereal have to be doing wrong? quietly behind a mascot everyone still loved, for a product this embedded in American breakfast habits to eventually disappear? The answer wouldn't show up for years, but it was already taking shape in decisions being made far from any Saturday morning cartoon. Long before anyone reaching for that box at the grocery store had any reason to worry. By the early 2000s, Waffle Crisp had already done the hard part. It had a loyal following, a recognizable mascot, and a flavor nobody else in the cereal aisle had bothered to copy. The harder part, the part that determines whether a novelty cereal becomes a permanent fixture or a forgotten one-hit product, was staying relevant once the initial excitement of Waffle Boy versus Professor Burnt Toast had run its course with the kids who first discovered it. Post's answer wasn't to leave the product alone. It was to keep adjusting it quietly in ways most shoppers never noticed at the time. The mascot itself became the clearest sign of that ongoing effort. Waffle Boy, who had carried the brand through its first real growth years, was eventually phased out in favor of a new character. Bronc, a dinosaur mascot with none of the built-in charm of a waffle-shaped superhero fighting burnt toast. It's the kind of decision that looks minor on paper, swap one cartoon character for another, but mascot changes in the cereal industry are rarely cosmetic. They usually signal a brand team trying to broaden appeal, chase a different demographic, or simply refresh a product that internal data suggests is aging out with its original audience. Whatever the exact internal reasoning, the shift from Waffle Boy to Bronc meant the cereal's most recognizable asset. The character kids like Waffle Crisp fans had grown up reciting commercials for was no longer the same character at all. At the same time, Post was managing Waffle Crisp within a portfolio that included dozens of other cereals, all competing for the same shelf space, the same advertising budget, and the same grocery buyer attention. A shelf that once might have had room for a novelty waffle cereal to sit comfortably next to the giants, the Cheerios, the Fruit Loops, the Frosted Flakes, was also filling up with newer competitors chasing the same nostalgia and sugar formula that had made Waffle Crisp work in the first place. Standing out required more than the original formula and mascot. It required Post to keep making decisions about where Waffle Crisp fit in a company-wide strategy, and those decisions weren't always going to favor the smaller, older novelty item over newer priorities. That pressure showed up most clearly in 2013, when Post introduced Waffle Crunch, a lower-priced version of the same basic concept, folded into the company's Good Mornings line of budget cereals. On its face, Waffle Crunch looked like simple brand extension. Give price-sensitive shoppers a cheaper way into the same maple waffle flavor profile. But a budget spin-off arriving 17 years after the original also said something quieter about where Post saw the brand heading, not necessarily as a premium, standalone product worth protecting at full price, but as a flavor concept flexible enough to be repackaged for a different price tier. It was the kind of move that made sense on a spreadsheet, and one that, in hindsight, sat right at the intersection of two products competing for the same shopper, the same shelf space, and increasingly, the same fading attention from a company managing far too many cereal lines to give any single one of them undivided focus. None of this was visible to the family filling their cart on a Tuesday afternoon. To them, Waffle Crisp was still Waffle Crisp. Still the box with the waffle-shaped pieces, still the cereal that made the milk taste like syrup, still sitting more or less where it always had. The mascot change registered, if at all, as a minor redesign. The arrival of Waffle Crunch on a nearby shelf just meant more options, not fewer. But inside Post, Waffle Crisp was no longer the fresh, self-selling novelty it had been in 1996. It was now one product among many, competing for internal attention in a company that was constantly launching new lines, discontinuing old ones, and recalculating which of its dozens of cereals deserved the marketing dollars and shelf negotiations needed to keep growing. The cereal hadn't lost its fans. It hadn't lost its flavor, but it had quietly entered the phase every long-running grocery product eventually reaches. The point where staying on the shelf depends less on how much people love it, and more on how much a company is still willing to fight to keep it there. By the mid-2000s, Waffle Crisp had crossed into a different kind of existence than most cereals ever reach. It was no longer a new product trying to earn its place on the shelf. It had become background, the kind of item nobody remembers deciding to buy because it had simply always been part of the routine. A parent restocking the pantry didn't think about Waffle Crisp as a choice anymore. It was just one of the boxes that belonged there, alongside the milk and the bread, replaced automatically when it ran out. The way people replace things they've stopped noticing precisely because those things have never let them down. That kind of invisibility is, in its own way, the highest compliment a grocery product can earn. Waffle Crisp had achieved genuine national distribution, sitting on shelves in supermarket chains across the country, not as a regional curiosity, but as a fixture recognized coast to coast. Estimating exact household penetration from the outside is difficult, and this is a place where the story has to be honest about its limits. Post never published precise figures on how many American kitchens kept a box on hand at any given time, but the cultural footprint left behind is its own kind of evidence. A cereal doesn't end up as a background prop in an episode of Friends, doesn't generate the volume of nostalgic recollection that still surfaces in comment sections and fan forums decades later, without having reached a genuine mass audience during its peak years. The commercials that define that peak are the clearest artifact of how deeply the brand had embedded itself. The battles between Waffle Boy and Professor Burnt Toast, and before that, the strange charm of the Granny Run Secret Factory, weren't just advertising a kid happened to see once or twice. They were repeated often enough across enough Saturday mornings that people who haven't tasted the cereal in over a decade can still describe the mascot's sneakers, still recall the tagline promising a taste like real homemade waffles. That's not casual brand awareness. That's the kind of recall companies spend millions trying to manufacture and almost never actually achieve. For the people on the inside, the factory workers running the production lines, the regional sales reps pitching grocery buyers on shelf space, this was the era when Waffle Crisp was, in the plainest terms, an easy product to move. A recognizable mascot, a flavor no direct competitor had matched, and a customer base that reordered out of habit rather than persuasion. Sales routes that included Waffle Crisp didn't require convincing grocery buyers that the product deserved space. The product had already proven it would sell. That's a rare position for any single item in a category as crowded and fast-turning as breakfast cereal, where new products launch constantly and most disappear within a year or two without ever reaching this kind of quiet, dependable normalcy. And normalcy is exactly what made Waffle Crisp powerful in a way its original marketing never fully anticipated. It stopped being a novelty cereal built around a gimmick and became something closer to a tradition, passed down the way small domestic habits get passed down. A parent who grew up with the Granny Factory commercials buying it for their own kids a decade later, not because of any advertising campaign, but because that waffle-shaped cereal was simply what breakfast was supposed to taste like on a Saturday. That kind of generational handoff is the real peak of any grocery product's life. It's the point where a brand stops needing to convince anyone of anything, because the product has already become part of how a family defines an ordinary morning. It's worth sitting with that for a moment, because everything that happens next only makes sense in light of how completely Waffle Crisp had woven itself into that routine. This wasn't a cereal clinging to relevance through nostalgia marketing. It was, for a long stretch of years, simply there. Reliable, familiar, unremarkable in the way only truly successful products get to be. Nobody thanks the box of cereal that's always in the cabinet. Nobody writes a tribute to the thing they've never had to think about. And that's precisely the danger of a product reaching this kind of quiet permanence. The moment people stop paying attention to something is exactly the moment a company can start changing it or deprioritizing it without anyone noticing until it's already gone. What was happening at that same moment inside boardrooms and product review meetings far removed from any breakfast table was the first sign that Waffle Crisp's comfortable place on the shelf wasn't as guaranteed as it looked from the outside. The mascot swap to Bronc had already happened. The budget spinoff was already in the works. And a company managing dozens of cereal lines was already quietly beginning to ask a question no shopper filling their cart could have anticipated. How long does a product get to coast on loyalty before someone decides that loyalty alone isn't enough to justify keeping it around? The trouble with Waffle Crisp didn't arrive as a single event. It arrived the way most quiet declines do, as a series of small, disconnected changes that nobody experiencing them in real time had any reason to string together into a pattern. A shopper doesn't track a brand's internal mascot decisions. A parent doesn't cross-reference a budget spinoff against a company's shifting marketing priorities. They just notice eventually that something feels slightly different without being able to say exactly what. The mascot change was the first thread. Bronk, the dinosaur who had replaced Waffle Boy, never carried the same cultural weight. There was no rival for him to battle, no tagline as sticky as the Granny Factory promise. Nothing that gave a new generation of kids the same reason to recite commercials the way their older siblings or parents once had. For longtime fans, the shift registered less as an outrage and more as a quiet erosion. The character on the box wasn't quite the one they remembered, and the cereal, while still tasting the same, no longer felt like it was being championed the way it once had been. A brand doesn't announce that it's deprioritizing a product. It just stops investing in the things that made people love it in the first place and waits to see if anyone notices. Waffle Crunch complicated the picture further. For a shopper who'd always bought the original, seeing a cheaper, similarly flavored option appear nearby on the shelf wasn't alarming. It looked like more choice, not less commitment. But inside a company managing shelf space and marketing budgets across dozens of competing cereal lines, the presence of a lower-cost alternative chasing the same flavor profile meant Waffle Crisp was no longer the sole way to capture that specific craving. Two products competing for the same customer under the same corporate roof rarely both get equal investment forever. Something usually gives, and this is where the story runs into the limits of what's actually documented. Post has never publicly stated an official reason for what happened to Waffle Crisp in the years leading up to 2018. There's no internal memo, no earnings call transcript, no executive quote explaining a formula change, a cost-cutting decision, or a strategic deprioritization. What exists instead is speculation from cereal industry watchers who have pointed to the success of other post-relaunches and new product lines, Oreo O's among them, as a possible explanation for where the company's attention and resources were shifting during this period. That theory is worth including here precisely because it's honest about what it is, an informed guess from people who follow the cereal industry closely, not a confirmed fact. Nobody outside Post's own leadership has ever said, on the record, exactly why Waffle Crisp's fortunes began to shift. What can be said with confidence is what shoppers experienced on the ground, because that part is well documented in the years of comments and recollections that followed. People describe a period, sometime before the official discontinuation, when the cereal grew harder to find. Not gone, but inconsistent. A store that always carried it would suddenly be out. A regular shopper would assume it was simply a restocking delay, the kind of thing that happens with any product occasionally, and grab something else that week without thinking much of it. Nobody treats an empty shelf slot as a crisis the first time they see it. They treat it as an inconvenience, and they come back the following week expecting it to be resolved. That's the quiet cruelty of how these things actually unfold. A parent in 2017 tossing a different cereal into the cart because Waffle Crisp wasn't in stock that day had no way of knowing they were watching the earliest, faintest signal of something much larger already moving through Post's internal decision-making. They weren't thinking about mascot changes or budget cereal lines or shelf space negotiations happening in a boardroom hundreds of miles from their local grocery store. They were just having a slightly annoying Tuesday. It's only in hindsight. Looking back from the other side of a discontinuation announcement, a petition, and years of fans mourning a cereal and comment sections, that those small inconsistencies start to look like warning signs instead of coincidences. How long can a product coast on decades of loyalty before a company decides that loyalty no longer justifies the shelf space, the production line, the marketing dollars it would take to keep fighting for it? Nobody buying a box of Waffle Crisp in 2017 was asking that question, but somewhere inside Post, in a room no shopper would ever see, that question was already being answered. And the answer was already on its way to the one place a cereal's fate actually gets decided. Not the cereal aisle, but a boardroom spreadsheet where a product's entire 20-year relationship with an American breakfast table gets reduced to a line that either stays or goes. Post's official public statement on Waffle Crisp's discontinuation was almost nothing at all. When customers began contacting the company directly, wondering why they could no longer find the cereal, Post's customer service confirmed only that the product had been discontinued as of August 2018, a bare acknowledgement, offered one inquiry at a time, with no press release, no farewell campaign, and no stated reason beyond the fact of the decision itself. For a cereal that had spent more than 2 decades on American shelves, that silence was its own kind of statement. Companies that are proud of a decision tend to explain it. Companies quietly retiring something rarely feel the need to justify themselves to anyone but the customers persistent enough to ask directly. That absence of an official explanation is the honest center of this chapter, and it has to be treated as exactly what it is. There is no confirmed internal memo describing a formula failure, no leaked financial report pointing to declining sales figures, no executive statement citing rising ingredient costs or shifting consumer tastes. What exists instead is a pattern of circumstantial evidence, visible from the outside, that lines up with how large food companies typically make these decisions. Post was, by the late 2010s, managing a sprawling portfolio of cereal brands, several of which, Oreo O's among them, had recently been relaunched or introduced to strong consumer response. Every cereal in that portfolio was competing internally for the same finite resources. Shelf space negotiated with individual grocery chains, marketing budgets allocated department by department, and production line time at facilities that could only run so many products at once. When a company suddenly has newer, higher momentum items pulling focus, older steady performers, even beloved ones, are the ones most likely to lose that internal competition, not because they failed, but because something else in the lineup is succeeding more visibly. This is speculation, and it has to be labeled as such, because that's the only honest way to tell this part of the story. Industry observers who cover the cereal category closely have floated this exact theory in the years since. The idea that Waffle Crisp wasn't killed by failure, but by a company simply choosing to point its attention elsewhere. It's a plausible read of the circumstantial timeline. It is not a confirmed fact, and no one outside Post's own leadership has ever gone on record to say definitively why the decision was made. What can be documented with more confidence is the experience of the people standing closest to the product as it wound down. The regional sales reps and the store-level buyers, whose job it was to keep shelves stocked with whatever a grocery chain had agreed to carry. For a product entering the final stretch of its production life, that job becomes a quiet, unglamorous kind of front line. Reorders slow down before anyone announces why. A distribution center stops replenishing a warehouse the way it once did. A buyer at a regional chain gets a notice that a particular SKU is being deprioritized, sometimes with no more explanation than the customers eventually received. None of this happens as a dramatic single moment. It happens as a series of small, procedural decisions made by people simply doing their jobs, each one nudging the product a little further toward the exit without any single person feeling responsible for the ending. That's the particular cruelty of how large companies retire a product like this. There's rarely a villain in the traditional sense. No single executive who woke up one morning and decided to kill a cereal an entire generation had grown up on. Instead, there's a slow accumulation of ordinary business logic. A mascot change that diluted the brand's identity, a budget spin-off that split its customer base, a portfolio reshuffling that favored newer, more exciting relaunches, and a company culture where an aging, steady product without a passionate internal champion becomes an easy line item to quietly discontinue rather than actively fight for. Waffle Crisp wasn't murdered. It was deprioritized, one unremarkable decision at a time, by people who most likely never thought of themselves as ending anything. Somewhere in that process, there was almost certainly a moment when someone inside Post understood the cereal was finished, long before the public did. It's the kind of moment that never gets documented in any way the outside world can verify. A production planning meeting where a line gets marked for phase out, a budget review where a product simply doesn't get a line item for the following fiscal year. Whoever sat in that room knew something that the millions of families still occasionally pouring a bowl of Waffle Crisp for their kids didn't. that the box on their shelf now had a countdown attached to it, even though nothing about the cereal itself, its taste, or its packaging had changed at all. And that's the injustice sitting quietly underneath this entire chapter of the story. The people who loved this cereal never did anything wrong. They didn't stop buying it. They didn't complain about the flavor. They kept restocking their pantries the same way they always had, trusting the way people trust products that have simply always been there, that it would keep being there. The decision that ended Waffle Crisp wasn't made in response to any failure on their part. It was made somewhere else entirely, by people they never met, weighing considerations they never knew existed, about a product that, to them, was simply breakfast. So who exactly was responsible for protecting a product that millions of people had built into their family routines without ever being asked whether they wanted to keep it? There's no clean answer. Not the sales team following orders. Not the marketing department managing a portfolio too large for any single brand to get a sustained attention. Not even the executives making a defensible business decision using ordinary corporate logic. The responsibility dissolves into a system where no individual choice looks unreasonable in isolation, and yet the sum of those choices is a cereal that, one ordinary week in August, simply stopped being made. That's exactly where the story goes next. Not into the boardroom anymore, but back out into the world, to the moment the decision finally became visible to the people who'd spent decades trusting that box would always be there. The end, when it finally came, wasn't announced. It was discovered. Sometime in the late summer of 2018, shoppers walking their usual route through the cereal aisle started noticing something wrong with the space where Waffle Crisp had always been. At first, it looked like an ordinary out of stock, a gap on the shelf, the kind that gets filled again within a week or two. But the gap didn't close. Days turned into weeks, and the space that had held a familiar waffle pattern box for over 20 years started filling instead with other products, other brands, cereals that had never needed to compete for that exact spot before. For a while, confusion outpaced grief. People assumed a supply hiccup, a distribution delay, a temporary shortage at their specific store. They drove to other grocery chains, checked warehouse clubs, asked employees who usually had no better answer than a shrug and a suggestion to check back next week. It was only when enough of these individual, isolated searches started comparing notes, in comment sections, in Facebook groups, in the kind of casual online conversation that happens when enough strangers realize they're all missing the same thing, that a pattern started to take shape. This wasn't one store. It wasn't one region. Waffle Crisp was gone everywhere, all at once, and nobody outside the company had been told why. The confirmation, when it finally arrived, came not from a press release, but from the most unglamorous channel imaginable: customer service. Shoppers frustrated enough to contact Post directly were told, plainly, that Waffle Crisp had been discontinued as of August 2018. No ceremony, no public statement acknowledging more than 2 decades on American shelves. Just a customer service representative confirming, one phone call and one email at a time, that the cereal people had grown up on was no longer being made. For a product that had quietly become part of so many families' weekly routines, the ending arrived with almost insulting simplicity, the kind of anticlimax that made the loss feel even sharper, because there was nothing to push back against. No campaign to protest, no executive to write to, just an absence, and a company willing to confirm it only when asked directly. What followed was not corporate mourning, because Post offered none. It was consumer mourning, organized entirely from the outside. Fan sites dedicated to cereal history and nostalgia posted the news, and the comment sections beneath those posts filled with a particular kind of grief that only makes sense once you understand how deeply ordinary this cereal had become in people's lives. Strangers wrote in describing exactly where they were when they found out, how many boxes they had left in the pantry, how they'd started rationing what remained rather than eating it normally. Some admitted they'd been in quiet denial for weeks, telling themselves it was just a stocking issue every time they checked the empty shelf, unwilling to accept that the explanation might be permanent. Others described searching foreign markets, discovering that countries where Waffle Crisp had also been sold were working through their own dwindling stock at a slower pace, buying time before the same emptiness caught up with them too. The online response eventually organized into something more concrete than scattered grief. A petition on change.org, calling directly on Post Foods to bring the cereal back. Its language wasn't corporate or strategic. It was personal, almost plaintive. People describing themselves as late-night cereal eaters, parents who ate a bowl after exhausting days with their kids, students who relied on it to stay awake while studying, describing a cereal that had somehow worked its way into completely different life stages for completely different reasons, united only by the specific, particular taste of maple-soaked waffle pieces that nothing else on the shelf quite replicated. It's easy to dismiss an online petition as a low-stakes gesture, a click that costs nothing and changes little. But petitions like this one function as something else too. A public record of exactly how many people cared enough to say so, a number a company can no longer pretend not to see once it starts climbing. Behind the visible grief of petitions and comment sections, there was a quieter, less documented loss happening at the production level. The discontinuation of Waffle Crisp meant the end of whatever dedicated production run had kept the cereal moving through post-manufacturing facilities for over 2 decades. A line that had employed workers, run schedules, and turned raw corn, oat, and wheat into millions of small waffle-shaped pieces destined for breakfast tables across the country. The specific fate of those production lines and the workers who ran them isn't detailed in any public account of the discontinuation. Post never issued a statement addressing what happened at the facility level when the line was shut down. What's certain is that somewhere, a production schedule that had run reliably for over 20 years simply stopped appearing on the calendar, and the people whose jobs had depended on that schedule had to adjust to a version of their work that no longer included Waffle Crisp at all. For the shoppers left behind, the final chapter of the disappearance played out in the strangest, most modern way a discontinued grocery product's afterlife can unfold. Online resale. Unopened boxes with the last surviving lot codes began appearing on second-hand marketplaces, sold not as food anymore, but as a kind of artifact, priced well above their original retail cost by people willing to pay a premium just to taste something they couldn't buy in a store anymore. It's a strange kind of tribute, a cereal box, originally worth a few dollars, suddenly valuable simply because it represented the last physical evidence of something a company had decided to stop making. Nobody buying those boxes was doing so for a bargain. They were doing it because the alternative was accepting that the taste was gone entirely. And for a product this embedded in personal memory, that acceptance came slower for some people than others. By the time the initial wave of online grief had settled into a kind of resigned nostalgia, the comment sections quieting, the petition signatures slowing, the last resale listings drying up as supply ran out entirely, Waffle Crisp had completed a transition that most discontinued products never fully make. It stopped being a cereal people could buy and became instead a cereal people remembered. A specific taste, tied to a specific era of childhood, preserved now only in the stories people told each other online, in old commercials occasionally resurfacing on video platforms, and in the particular ache of walking past a cereal aisle and noticing, still years later, the space where something used to be. For most of the products that vanished from American grocery shelves, the story ends where the last chapter left it, with an empty space, a fading memory, and nothing left to do but grieve. Waffle Crisp didn't follow that pattern. What happened next made it something rarer in the history of discontinued grocery brands. A genuine reversal, driven not by a corporate rebrand or a licensing deal, but by the accumulated weight of people who simply refused to stop asking for it back. The pressure built slowly over roughly 3 years. The Change.org petition kept collecting signatures long after the initial wave of shock had passed, becoming less a one-time protest and more a standing, visible record of demand that anyone at Post could check whenever they wanted a reminder of how many people still cared. Fan communities kept the cereal alive in conversation the way people keep any lost thing alive, retelling the same commercials, trading the same memories, occasionally speculating, without any real evidence, about whether the company might ever bring it back. That kind of sustained organic attention is difficult for any brand to manufacture intentionally and nearly impossible to fake. It's also, as it turned out, difficult for a company to ignore indefinitely once it becomes large enough to notice. By early 2021, Post had decided to test the waters. The company's senior associate brand manager, Joe Woodward, later described the decision as a direct response to how much continued interest fans had shown in Waffle Crisp even years after its discontinuation. Evidence, in other words, That this wasn't a passing wave of nostalgia, but a genuine, sustained demand Post could no longer treat as background noise. Rather than commit immediately to a full national relaunch, Post brought the cereal back carefully, as a limited release, sold once again in bags rather than the boxes longtime fans remembered. Ahead of the return, the company sent samples directly to social media influencers, a marketing approach that would have been unthinkable in Waffle Crisp's original 1996 launch, but one perfectly suited to reintroducing a nostalgia product to an audience now old enough to have their own social media followings and their own decades-old memories to share. The limited relaunch did what limited relaunches are designed to do. It tested demand without fully committing resources to it, and the demand held. Fans who had spent 3 years describing the cereal in the past tense suddenly had the chance to buy it again, and the response validated everything the petition and signatures and comment section grief had suggested all along. This wasn't manufactured nostalgia. People actually wanted the product back, not just the memory of it. That validation led to something more permanent. In 2022, Post announced that Waffle Crisp would return to shelves for good, not as another limited-time novelty, but as a standing part of the company's lineup once again, with an initial rollout at Walmart before expanding to other major retailers over the following months. This time, the cereal came packaged in boxes rather than bags, a small but noticeable departure from both its original format and its brief 2021 return. A reminder that even a beloved product coming back from the dead doesn't come back entirely unchanged. It's now available in 2 sizes, and while some fans online have noted it can still be harder to find in certain stores than they'd like, the cereal exists again as a genuine, ongoing retail product rather than a memory kept alive only in comment sections and resale listings. The significance of that reversal extends beyond one cereal brand. Waffle Crisp's return stands as a documented example of something food companies rarely have to reckon with in such a public, sustained way. Proof that consumer demand, organized loudly and persistently enough online, can actually reverse a discontinuation decision that seemed final at the time. Most products that disappear from grocery shelves stay gone permanently, no matter how many people miss them, because the economics of restarting a production line rarely justify the nostalgia of a vocal minority. Waffle Crisp's fan base was large enough and persistent enough to change that calculation. It's worth noting that Post made a similar choice around the same period with another retired brand, Oreo O's, suggesting this wasn't an isolated act of sentiment, but part of a broader recognition inside the company that some discontinued products still carried enough goodwill to be worth reviving rather than leaving behind for good. For the community that had spent 3 years mourning the cereal, refreshing petition pages, and trading memories of a taste they could no longer buy, the return meant something more than a marketing win. It meant the specific, particular version of childhood they remembered. The maple-soaked waffle pieces, the crunch that held up through an entire cartoon, the box that had sat in so many pantries without anyone thinking to appreciate it while it lasted, hadn't been erased permanently after all. It had simply been waiting for enough people to say, loudly and repeatedly, that it mattered. What does it mean, then, that a company can be moved to reverse a decision like this? Not by internal strategy, but by the accumulated voice of ordinary people refusing to let a product disappear quietly? And what does it say about which discontinued tastes get a second chance, and which ones never do, no matter how many people remember loving them? There's a specific moment worth returning to, one last time, before this story closes. A bowl on a Saturday morning, cartoons already running on the television, the milk just beginning to turn that pale gold color it always did once the syrup started to dissolve. The waffle-shaped pieces held their shape longer than anyone expected a cereal to, crunching all the way through a full episode, right up until the last spoonful pulled from the bottom of the bowl. There was a dusting of cinnamon in the smell before the milk even hit the bowl, and underneath all of it, that specific promise the earliest commercials made decades ago, that somehow, impossibly, this tasted like a real homemade waffle, made by someone who cared whether you liked it. That memory belongs to millions of people now in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and it never really needed the cereal to be perfect to matter. It needed to be reliable. It needed to be there, week after week, without anyone having to ask twice. What made Waffle Crisp matter was never really about ingredients or flavor engineering. It was about what the cereal represented inside a household routine. A small, dependable pleasure that asked nothing of anyone, that didn't require a parent to cook or a kid to wait, that simply existed as a 5-minute pocket of comfort at the start of a day that hadn't asked for anything hard yet. In households where both parents worked, where mornings moved fast and nobody had time for a real waffle iron, a bowl of Waffle Crisp was its own quiet kindness. The shortcut that still felt like an indulgence rather than a compromise. It mattered too because of what it modeled about attention. A company built an entire product around the idea that a shortcut breakfast could still feel handmade, still feel like someone had gone to the trouble, even when nobody had. Whether or not that idea was ever entirely true is beside the point. It worked, and it worked precisely because it understood something true about childhood. Kids don't need efficiency explained to them. They need to feel cared for. And a cereal with a grandmother mascot claiming to have made every piece by hand, however manufactured that idea actually was, gave an entire generation a small daily dose of that feeling before they even knew to look for it. No replacement cereal since has quite managed the same trick. The waffle shape, the specific syrup flavor, the particular way it held its crunch. Competitors have tried. None of them have fully closed the gap, in which is part of why the loyalty never faded, even during the 3 years the cereal wasn't available to buy at all. And this is where Waffle Crisp's story sets itself apart from so many others like it. Most discontinued grocery products end in absence, a taste preserved only in memory, a shelf space filled permanently by something else, a generation left to describe a flavor to children who will never get to taste it themselves. This one didn't end that way. It ended instead with proof that memory itself can carry weight, that enough ordinary people describing the same small loss, publicly and persistently, can occasionally reach far enough to change a decision that once looked permanent. The cereal came back different in small ways. A box instead of a bag, a rollout that started at one retailer before spreading, but it came back. The grannies and the waffle-shaped pieces and the syrup-soaked promise of a homemade breakfast are, once again, sitting on a shelf somewhere, waiting for a new kid to reach for the box without any idea how close that particular taste once came to disappearing for good. So this isn't quite a eulogy in the traditional sense. It's closer to a note of gratitude for the factory workers who kept a production line running for decades without much recognition, for the food scientists who figured out how to make a cereal crunch survive a full bowl of milk, for the parents who restocked a pantry item they never thought twice about, and for the fans stubborn enough to keep signing a petition long after most people would have simply moved on. Somewhere tonight, someone is pouring a bowl of Waffle Crisp for a kid who has no idea this cereal ever left the shelf at all. They'll never know about the empty space in 2018, the petitions, the influencers, the boardroom decisions nobody ever fully explained. They'll just know it's Saturday, the cartoons are on, and the milk is turning that particular shade of gold it always does. That in the end is exactly what the whole story was protecting.